this particular video, I want to make the point of the huge benefits that you can have by engaging with spiritual traditions, perhaps traditions that have been around for thousands of years. And for me, the main one I think of is usually Buddhist monasteries, because those guys are the real deal. You have to remember that if it's like a proper monk, these guys are meditating more than 10 hours a day. And if we compare that to most of us, that is on some way other level. Now, the point isn't to glorify them too much, but a lot of these people, especially the senior monks, they are really genuine fountains of love. And by engaging with these people, there is a deep wisdom within the tradition that has been around for thousands of years. And due to that history, there is a lot of wisdom that can flow from them to you in a really spiritual sense. Because watching something on the internet is great, but when you engage with another physical person in the same room as you, there's a lot of subtle energy that can get transferred. You know, there's very famous stories of a Hindu yogi called Ramamaya Rishi, and he would change people's lives by the look that he gave people. So these subtle energy exchanges that you can have with perhaps senior monks that hopefully are genuine fountains of service, genuine fountains of love. If you can be in their presence and be open like a sponge to their energy, then you can you can definitely become more like that yourself. So I think that's a really interesting part of being a human being, that we feel empathy with other people. And if you look at neuroscience, we actually have mirror neurons in our brain. And what that means is when we see someone else experiencing something or someone else expressing themselves, some part of our brain is copying that or projecting ourselves onto them. So when there is a monk or whoever, some spiritual traditional leader that is hopefully somewhat attained, if you see them speak and the way that they animate themselves, your brain is copying that, and that creates a certain flow in the mind, and that can be like a seed, vibration perhaps you could even call it, that you can amplify within yourself to become more like that to the extent that you wish. Now, before I go on this really fascinating topic, I did think about this and I want to talk about the positives today. But if you go exploring multiple traditions, multiple monasteries perhaps, which I definitely encourage, I encourage you to check out all the religions in your local area and just compare them, feel what they're all about. But if you're going to be doing this, then it's very, very likely that you are going to run into dogma, and it's also quite likely that you're going to run into some cults. So I'm not going to spend much time on that here, but I'll just put a pinned comment below, which I think will be really important. Just some tips that you can easily recognize dogma or cults when you see them. And when you see it, just leave. There's no pressure to stick around. If your intuition isn't feeling good, if your heart isn't feeling like there's genuine service happening here, then just leave. There's no pressure to stay. Because that's what we really want. We want to find people that are genuine fountains of outpouring love so that we can soak up that energy. We don't want to get caught up in some side track. So the main thing, if you get the opportunity to engage one-on-one with these spiritual monks, perhaps, these spiritual people that spend their whole life dedicated towards spirituality, the main sort of insight or suggestion I would like to offer you is there will be opportunities usually for questions and answers, a direct engagement. And I would suggest asking vulnerable questions. That is really the key to success, the key to absorbing their love, their fountain of love within yourself. Because if you're engaging at an intellectual level or asking for like practical advice, that's fine, it can be useful. But if you ask something that feels vulnerable to you, then that opens up the emotional side of you, and that means the words that the other person say has real power. Okay, so just for an easy example, I saw a monk recently, really, I didn't know he was going to be there, but he's quite famous, called Ajahn Brahman, and I'm quite lucky living in Western Australia that there's a really big monastery nearby. And I didn't have any burning questions to ask the man, but I thought intuitively came up to ask about my sleep paralysis that I sometimes get, because to me that feels like a bit of a vulnerable thing to admit, because it's saying to the monk that sometimes I experience fear due to paralysis, paralyzing fear. So you're sort of admitting something that's the underbelly of your emotions, something a bit soft about yourself. And once you ask the question, my suggestion would be that what is important is the flow of energy. It's to engage your mirror neurons, because the content of the answer could be insightful, but what's more relaxing or more useful to you is the flow, the way in which this spiritual person gives you the answer. So when I asked about the sleep paralysis, Ajahn Brahman gave me an answer and it was fine. But the way in which he was communicating to me was so relaxed. I remember the way he was holding his hand. It was so clear that he had utter bliss, utter relaxation in his hands, in his arms, in his whole body, as he was talking about paralyzing fear. And that's the energy, the fountain of love that I could access a little bit like a sponge to help just absorb that energy. So that's just a suggestion for me, or from me to you, to experiment with. And when the person is talking again, really focus on them. Don't get sidetracked. I don't recommend closing your eyes even. Look at their body language. Look at their facial expressions, the way they move their hands, the tonality of their voice. And you can almost enter a trance-like state and just absorb their essence. But again, don't go falling into some cult. A very important rule or guideline, rather, about spirituality when you're engaging with spiritual teachers of whatever kind is the guideline is to not become a needy clinger. If you meet some of these people that are quite attained, that are genuine fountains of love, you will very likely find that they have a real power to them and it makes you feel amazing. You can feel blissed out by the way that they look at you. And that's fantastic. You can get an influx of this love energy. But you don't want that to become a clinginess, that you need that person for your spirituality. Every drop of love they give you, every drop of energy they give you, the idea is to internalize that and be able to stand on your own 2 feet stronger and not to become a sheep of theirs and need them every step of the way. Internalize what they say and then move on yourself. And if you get the opportunity to engage with them again, fantastic. But it is always good, I think, to keep engaging with multiple spiritual people if you can, multiple traditions even, so that we don't get too caught up with a single source of a fountain of love. Because we don't want to be drinking from their fountain of love forever. The idea is that their fountain of love is a spark, an initial frequency hit, so that we can amplify ourselves into becoming a fountain of love. Okay? So I hope that makes sense. And of course, if you want to be like a sponge and absorb this love that they're pouring out of them, then, there's a very famous sort of metaphor, which is that you need to empty your cup, your thoughts, your beliefs when you get an answer. So if someone is telling you something, perhaps they're telling you a religious story, don't question it, just fully absorb it. And after you've absorbed it, then you can question it, you can engage with it, and you can even ask them questions, because skepticism and questioning is fantastic. That's how you engage. But before you start questioning it, just fully absorb. the information. Also, as a little tip, I would recommend experimenting with mudras as you are receiving an answer. If you just ask the spiritual person your question, I like this mudra. I hope you can see that on camera. Usually I hold it down just below the belly button, but this mudra, if you get into the flow of it, it is like you are channeling their energy into yours through just the mudra. So that's something, a little hint that you could perhaps experiment with, but don't get too stuck up on it. You don't need to be in any mudra or any posture. So I thought that was quite interesting. My hard drive just disconnected, but I didn't lose all the footage I shot beforehand. So I think that is actually quite a nice bonus for me. But I'm nearly finished with this topic. I just have three more points I want to mention. The first is that if you're going to be visiting monasteries, to keep your expectations sort of realistic and not to think that every monk you're going to meet is this pure fountain of unconditional love that is just a massive enlightened Buddha, okay? But even if a monk is just starting out, they still have a huge amount of value to offer us because they've committed their whole lives towards the spiritual endeavor of going inwards. So they're really committed people. We can already learn a lot just from that alone. And by engaging with them, there is almost always a lot of value that we can get. Even if they're not this absolute fountain of outpouring love, there will be some value there that we can usually find if we are open to it. The other thing I want to say is that a huge benefit that might not be obvious immediately is the butterfly effect of life when visiting these places. Perhaps you just get one word of wisdom or one simple piece of advice, or you meet one friend there that through these sort of chain reactions in life, in 10 or 20 or 30 years, puts you in a totally different place in life. It could mean that you're in a different country even, or that you found your life purpose and are living that deeply. Even if it's not a huge bang moment, the butterfly effect of life can be really, really powerful. So that's another reason I would highly recommend actually exploring these spiritual places. And I've seen quite a few times in life by visiting temples or monasteries, a small detail through the butterfly effect amplifies into a big, very beneficial life change. And lastly, if we're going to be visiting these monasteries and hopefully meeting outpouring fountains of love and hopefully soaking up that love so that we become fountains ourselves, that is a huge blessing that that place is giving us. So I think it feels good, since we also want to be outpouring fountains, to give a blessing in return. And that can come in many forms. It can be a financial donation, or it can be fruit or food, perhaps. Maybe they are sharing food there at the monastery, then you can bring your own meal to share with everyone. And it can also be something really nice, like flowers, for instance, or some sort of a decoration, just to show that you are also in a spirit of goodwill. You are not in a mode of only taking, you are also in a mood of pouring out blessings. And you can also bless them with words by saying thank you, by saying some sort of a genuine feeling of goodwill. And you can visualize and imagine white light coming at them, or whatever nice intuitive piece of blessing that you want to give them. Because ultimately, that is what we're trying to do. We are trying to be a blessing in the world, just as these monks are unconditional fountains of blessings.